Hey, why don't we get started? Again, I want to welcome everybody to actually our last meeting of the season. Our season lasts 10 months, and we take a bit of a break in July and August. I really shouldn't say we, it's basically Dana and Ben. I really want to acknowledge all of them for all the hard work they did putting, I think, a great year of programs together. It's not easy. It's not easy. I actually did that job about 20 years ago, and Dana's doing it now, and it's a lot of work. And I think the quality of the presentations and everything is a lot better now than it was when I was doing it. So again, I want to thank Dana and off month after month. Thank you. Also, I really do want to give a warm welcome to Stephanie. You know, PHSNE has a long history of interest in photography in China. In fact, we had field trips back there in China in 1999, year 2000, and again 2003. And we haven't been there in a while. Maybe someday we'll get back there. But in the meantime, we are very, very fortunate. And Chinese photography come to us, and that by way of Stephanie. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dana, and you can maybe introduce Stephanie first. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Hi, I'm Dana G. I'm the program coordinator for PHSNE, and we're tonight welcoming Stephanie Tung, who is the Byrne Family Curator of Photography at the Peabody Essex Museum. And before we get started, let me just do a few housekeeping notes. Please stay on mute during the presentation and type your questions into the chat. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen, a little speech balloon icon. And then I will relay those to Stephanie at the end. And if there's time, we can set aside some more questions for the end of the presentation. And during the presentation, if you go up to the top right in the view option, speaker is best for the presentation. So please stay in speaker view for the presentation. And if there's any technical issues, just type them into the chat and we'll do our best to help you. And so for tonight, Stephanie Tung is the Byrne Family Curator of Photography at the Peabody Essex Museum, and she will speak about the recent exhibition, Power and Perspective, Early Photography in China, which she co-curated with Karina Corrigan, the H.A. Crosby Forbes Curator of Asian Export Art. This exhibition explored the introduction and adoption of photography in the 19th century China. Many items in the exhibit were sourced from PEM's own collections, and it featured 130 photographs and dialogue with paintings, decorative arts, and prints to provide a rich account of the exchanges between photographers, artists, patrons, and subjects in Treaty Port, China. And the exhibition's contemporary section featured emerging Chinese photographers who participated in a 3-month-long virtual collaboration. The new works offered personal insights into China today. Stephanie will also discuss PEM's As We Rise, Photography from the Black Atlantic, which is opening at PEM June 17th. And prior to joining PEM in 2018, Stephanie worked at the Three Shadows Photography Art Center in Beijing as a curator and director of international affairs. She's published widely on photography and contemporary art from China. And her most recent book, Ai Weiwei, Beijing, 1993 to 2003, was co-authored with Ai Weiwei and John Tancock and serves as a continuation of Ai Weiwei, New York, 1983 to 1993, for which she also served as lead researcher. And Stephanie holds a BA in Literature and History of Art and Architecture from Harvard University, a Master's of Arts in Art and Archaeology from Princeton, and this year she's completing her PhD in Princeton's Art and Archaeology program with her dissertation, Pictorial China, Art Photography in the Republican Era, 1923 to 1929. So thank you, Stephanie, so much for being here. And the tour that we had in March was just wonderful, and we thank you and Bing so much for that. And so now I will pass it on to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dana and Ben and John, for organizing this session. This is really, really wonderful to see so many faces and who are excited to hear about this topic. And thank you to all the members of PHSNE for joining me on this rainy Sunday evening. I think this is what better way to pass a Sunday evening to talk about photo. So yeah, a little bit about myself. I'm the newly appointed Byrne Family Curator of Photography at PEM. I'm going to be speaking about like a half an hour on power and perspective, giving you the behind the scenes of the exhibition. And then I'm going to spend about 10 minutes on As We Rise, which is opening in 2 weeks. A little bit about my own sort of educational background. I was mostly interested in literature and art history painting as an undergrad, but then I took one course in photography at Harvard and that changed everything. I worked a lot with Robin Kelsey, who was over there and thinking about ideas of photography and chance. And then when I went over to China, I was working in a photo gallery and learning all about photo there. And then I went back to grad school at Princeton, where my advisor is Anne Macaulay. And so she is a historian of 19th century French photography. And so I think about how a lot of those ideas about markets in European photography might be applicable or similar or different to what's going on in China. So that's, you know, a little bit about what I am doing. And I think Dana's right, I still have a dissertation to write this summer. But I'm really excited to share with you guys this sort of exhibition that we just finished and what is coming up for the summer at PEM. And so maybe at the end of this session, we can also have Q&A about, you know, the photo department at PEM and like, you know, photo collections. And just I'd love to hear your thoughts about the shows and the directions of the exhibitions. So yeah, very happy to be here. So consider this a sneak peek about what's coming. And then I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, everything look good? Yeah, full screen? Okay. So I know many members of PHSNE came out to PEM for an in-person tour of Power and Perspective. So thank you for coming out. I had a really, really fun time with that tour. And so some of this might be familiar. So I'm going to try to go through this relatively quickly just to give broad brushstrokes about the big ideas of the show and give you a little bit more of the insight into the how and why we did some of this or the sort of curatorial choices that we made for this show. So Power and Perspective is an exhibition that was 4 years in the making, and it explores the introduction and adoption of photography in 19th century China. As Dana said, it was co-curated by myself and Karina Corrigan, and it mines PEM's extensive collection of early photography in China to reframe photography as an inherently social medium that requires the active participation of many people, including viewers like you. And so, to do this, I'm going to give a little bit more of a sort of overview of the PEM collection, and then we're going to go into the exhibition itself. PEM has the distinction of being the oldest continuously running and collecting museum in the United States. Salem, where PEM is located, is now mainly known as a Boston suburb that is famous for its witches, or maybe lack thereof, and also the Halloween capital of the world. But in the 1800s, Salem was a major global seaport and the wealthiest city per capita in the United States. And much of that wealth came from China, trade in tea, porcelain, ivory, silks, and opium. And by the 19th century, many of the Salem merchants who were living and working in China were also bringing back photographs of the places that they lived and the places that they did business with. So many of PEM's photography collections, especially its 19th century photography collections, joined the collection in the 19th century. That means it wasn't acquired later. It was not acquired in auction. They came with lots and lots of material from the families that lived in China themselves. And so it's consequently much more better documented than other sort of collections and institutions. And it comes with a lot of archival papers and also like other objects that were assembled at this time. So you can really sort of see how photography fits into a sort of a collector's, I think, whole lifestyle, which is quite interesting. And to my knowledge, I think there are not many of these sort of publicly accessible collections in China itself due to war and politics. And so this really interesting collection provides a wonderful resource for the study of early Chinese photography, but it also presented some challenges because a lot of the things came in the 19th century. They were not really well documented in terms of considered as art objects. They were part of this whole institution. And so we had to sort of come together and understand and try to gather this information from many different departments, the library, and sort of understand the provenances of how they got here. Topic-wise, I think there is also a bit of unevenness in the subject matter. The strengths and weaknesses of the holdings reflect the interests, desires, and biases of those early collectors. So for example, we have lots and lots of portraits of merchants, Western and Chinese merchants, and scenes of treaty ports, because these were the places where business was being held. But photographs of locations elsewhere in China or even of the imperial family are much more rare or even absent. So those are the things that we don't have because they were not accessible to those early collectors at that time. So in interpreting this collection, we had to really think about that sort of legacy of how this collection got here and what are the sort of gaps that might be missing. So we chose to open the show with, not with a photograph, but with a camera. And what you see here is a beautiful American-made camera from the 1850s, which was very similar to, I think, the cameras that were imported to China at the time when photography was first introduced. And opening with a camera allowed us to do a couple things that I think were really important for us as curators in the show. It introduced the difficulty of the 19th century process. I think most of the audience here will know about it, but I think for a general audience, including when we talk to a lot of young kids, we often start with who has a camera in their pocket? And, the young kids will say yes, but then we introduced that this is a camera. And it just blows their mind. And so this was an important step, I think, for us to center this experience and the photographs that were made during this period was a completely different technology than what we have in our iPhones today. And so I think that's something that for a general audience, we really wanted to keep in mind that, that this is very difficult and very different. And it sort of also allowed us to start talking about the process of making these photographs, that they required time, money, labor, and luck. And that sort of added to a sense of how these photographs were used to tell stories that might privilege certain points of view. And so that, I think, was one of the sort of ways that we chose to start the exhibition. We also wanted to ask people to toggle back and forth between zooming into the photograph and looking at the close details, and then looking at reminding people about what's outside of the frame, the historical, political, and social contexts that were actually really important for understanding why these photographs were made. And so I think that's a sort of way of viewing or way of understanding these photographs that we wanted to teach a general public how to do. So we designed the exhibition to open with a section called Imperial Eye. And so it started with the colonial introduction of photography in 1844, and then it would gradually increase focus to on stories of Chinese agency and the adoption of photography. So here, the first words in our exhibition label copy are actually aim, shoot, capture. Much of the language of photography evokes the gun. Photography and colonial violence share in closely intertwined history. We wanted to address plainly that photo was first introduced to China in 1844 as a result of the First Opium War. So this section actually really follows the sort of development of the Second Opium War through the work of Felice Beato. Felice Beato was a photographer that was embedded with the British Army And he created a visual narrative that was trying to really celebrate, I think, the British power and dominance. And so you see on the left side of this photograph, the photograph that he created with the British encampment and the British flag at the very top. It's centered at the very top of the pyramid, and the sort of the battlefield below. And then I think we tried to talk a lot about the ethics of war photography and what he was trying to do in creating this and who his market was. And I think we did that by having these sort of seen and unseen panels that sort of zoom out, like I said, to give you a little bit more of that beyond the frame information. There are 5 of these in the exhibition. So they're these interventions where we talk about the politics and the history and the context. And it really, I think, helps us reframe what we're seeing to sort of think about the motivations that the photographer had. In this one, for example, we were thinking a lot about how Beato's photographs relate to the nascent genre of war photography. He was trained in Crimea in India, but he also set many precedents for conflict photographers that followed. So for instance, he was the first photographer to photograph fallen soldiers. This was years before Gardner's photographs of the fallen soldiers of the Civil War. And so I think a lot of those photographs are very gruesome. And I think we're very much created for that sort of graphic shock quality. And so we wanted to talk about that, but we didn't want to sort of display it again in a way that was too sort of sensational. And so we talk about it here, about how those photographs were something that he sort of set many precedents for. And then we have a whole catalog essay in which we sort of break down and get really deep into those photographs. So other seen and unseen panels in this exhibition are talking about the communities represented in the collection, portrayals of labor, justice, and women. To do the sort of other thing that I was talking about, zooming really, really close into the photographs, we have also these digital interactives called in focus stations at the very, you can see one at the back of this photo. And there are 4 of these in the exhibition, and they're designed as guided close looking exercises. You can scroll through them and it'll take you deep, deep, deep into the photograph itself to think about the choices that the photographers made. And so here you can also see that while this is a photography show, principally, we also incorporated a lot of 3-dimensional material from the Asian export art collections to give you a sense of the sort of visual culture of this period. So here you see an ivory diorama of the Guangzhou port, as well as an ivory desk that we think were examples of the kinds of things that were looted from the Yuan palaces. The next and largest section of the show is called Navigating Worlds. And here we wanted to get into this idea of the treaty ports, these nodes of exchange that sort of happened after the wars. The treaties that ended those conflicts, the First and Second Opium Wars, granted foreigners the right to live and trade in port cities such as Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Fuzhou. And the arrival of these Western merchants, soldiers, and missionaries transformed the architecture and culture of these cities, many of which became the first sites of photography studios in China. And so innovation and competition were swirling side by side in these cities as Chinese and Western photographers were opening studios. And here we also wanted to highlight how photography and another imported technology, the steamship, were rapidly transforming the coast. And there's like a sort of symbiotic relationship, I think, between the steamship and photography. We have a lot of photographs of the places that steamships could go because those were the places that the photographers were using the steamship to travel from place to place. And then conversely, those sort of, they really popularized the steamship sort of operations. And so they have this really important sort of transformational effect on these places at this time. I love this little incense burner on the right. You see this, it's a lacquer steamship that is made of, it's made of Chinese lacquer, but it's actually an incense burner. So you can put incense inside and smoke rises off the top of the steamship. So it's really one of my favorites. Okay. Okay. So a steamship is also at the heart of this panorama. This is a Charles Leander Weed mammoth plate panorama, a set of 3 photographic mammoth plates. And so here we wanted to talk about how this exhibition, much of this exhibition is about the call and response of photography and other media. We just saw in the previous slide an ivory diorama of Guangzhou. Then there was also an oil painting of Guangzhou. And then now we see the photograph of Guangzhou all around this a similar period. And so I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that in this panorama, they also have the steamship. So you kind of see how in each of the sort of different media, they're sort of focusing on this idea of the port with the steamship at the center. And so it's different media, and each of these media have different sort of advantages and disadvantages, obviously. Ivory and oil are able to portray the city from a bird's eye view in color, while the photographs are limited by the height of the camera. But they also provide an incredible amount of detail. If you zoom in, you can really see even the people that are working on the docks, which is kind of incredible to think about. So these are mammoth plate prints. They're by Charles Leander Weed, who's an American photographer who traveled from, I think, New York to the West Coast, San Francisco, then to China, then back to San Francisco, then went to Yosemite and then Japan and China again with this mammoth plate print. And so I think it's also incredible to think about how this technology moves. These were, I think, the first mammoth plate prints taken in China. And then when you actually are standing in front of these prints and you realize they're contact prints, these are huge. So then you also think about, like, in order to take this photograph, he had to be standing across the river with this massive machine and this in this dark room, and just imagining how many the glass plate even. It just boggles my mind how difficult it must have been to make these photographs and have them survive to this day, and to think about how they're related to the ways that he created landscapes in Japan and Yosemite as well. So I think these are super interesting. So within this section, I think we also have this seen and unseen panel here, which is about the treaty port communities. And I think this is really to help us think about the ways in which photography can think about who's not depicted. Because of our collection, we have lots and lots of photographs of business interests and the sort of ties between American and Chinese merchants, group portraits, family portraits, things like that. But I think they also are reminding us that it's only really a small sliver of life in these treaty ports in these cities. Women, not white people, and non-elites are generally not included, or if they are, they're rarely at the very sort of edges of the frame. So how do we account for those outside of the photo, thinking beyond, again, the frame? One of the things that we discovered was we really depended on things like oral histories, library archives, and material objects to sort of give us a bigger picture of what's happening and who we might not have photographs of. An example of this is the sort of cabinet card of HB and JB Endicott of Shanghai on the right. We realized that they were the biracial sons of a Massachusetts merchant named James Endicott and a Hong Kong woman named Ng Ah Q. And Ng Ah Q was somebody who had been sold as an indentured servant to Endicott, but then became a major player in Hong Kong real estate and steamship companies. And this is all through like archival documentation, genealogy research. And we don't have any photograph of her, but we have like this story of her life because of these photographs of her sons. And we use this oil painting from a related family as somebody who is like standing in for that person. And so that we can sort of think about how these photographs are actually helping us tell bigger stories, that there are people who are not actually, who are missing from the collection. And to end this section is this lovely wall, which is a photograph of a storefront on Queens Road. And Queens Road was the sort of souvenir and like sort of photo center of Hong Kong. Right next to this was the photo studio of many, many famous photographers like Floyd and Lai Fong. And so it just really makes us, I think a little bit more about how these objects are circulating. We have an ivory wall on the right here, in which you can see a lot of the ivories are one-to-one matches with what's in the photograph by John Thompson. And all those ivory pieces are related to people who also purchased photographs. And so you can think about how they were kind of similar in terms of like memory makers and souvenirs, tokens of memory and souvenirs. My favorite part of this photograph is the sort of fan that is on the left side of this photograph. There's a man who's holding a fan that has a 16th century poem that's written on it. And it's a poem by Wang Yuming, and it's about trying to find solace and peace in the countryside, away from the bustle of the city. And so I think it's a way for the man who's holding the fan to sort of have a signal that says, like, to Chinese readers, that this is something that I think trying to get away from the sort of political turmoil and city turmoil of Hong Kong at this time. Okay, so the next section is called Artistic Exchange, and it highlights a sort of a really important loan of 2 daguerreotypes by Jules Itier, which really allowed us to explore the sort of story of encounter and exchange at the heart of this exhibition. Beginning in the 18th century, artists in Guangzhou adopted Western painting styles and mediums to appeal to visiting merchants. Their paintings in oil and gouache were aesthetic and cultural hybrids that reflect Guangzhou's role as a global center for trade. So in 1844, the Cantonese oil painter known as Lam Qua on the right visited the foreign settlement in Guangzhou to see a new wonder, the daguerreotype camera bought to China by French customs official Jules Itier. And Lam Qua requested a demonstration, and Itier obliged, making a daguerreotype portrait of the painter and gifting it to him. 1 week later, Lam Qua returned in an act of reciprocity, but also artistic one-upmanship. He gifted Itier a small box containing a miniature self-portrait on ivory, which Lam Qua had carefully painted after his own photographic likeness. And so this is a story of exchange. Itier did take the first photographs of China in 1844, but it was immediately received not with sort of suspicion or like sort of or fear. It was actually just accepted into the visual marketplace, and then even copied in an act of just like, well, I think my painting can do better than what this daguerreotype can offer. And so we don't have those objects left, but we do have a miniature ivory that is very similar to what we think Lam Qua could have made. The center is a daguerreotype portrait by Itier of a different merchant named Pan Shikua. So we think that is what that sort of daguerreotype that Itier made looked like. And then on the right is a print in a French newspaper that is a copy of the Lam Qua painting after the daguerreotype, as a sort of, and it was printed when Itier took all of these objects back to France for exhibition. And then in the middle of this exhibit gallery is really how I think Chinese photographers and studios started to adopt this medium. I think Lam Qua was really interested in photography, but he was also fundamentally worried that it was going to put him out of a job. And here we see how I think a lot of these studios, these artist studios in Guangzhou and Hong Kong started to adopt photography. For example, in the center, we see 3 works by the Chaohua studio in Shanghai. They were making ivory miniatures, paintings, but also daguerreotype, these albumen prints and paintings at the same time. So these are all sort of related. The one sort of area that didn't really get replaced or sort of have photography infiltrate that market so much was the sort of ship paintings up on the upper right. And we think that that's something that's related to this idea that ship portraits were very, very expensive, and you wanted to actually see the flags of the ship. And you couldn't really do that with a photograph at that time, capturing the flag in like the sort of the ship in its like sort of glory. And so you can see that we have lots of examples of the oil paintings of ship that last well into the 19th century, close to the end of the 19th century. Okay, the fourth section of this exhibit is called China as Told By, and explores how narratives are conveyed through albums. Most of the framed photographs in the exhibition were originally part of albums, and so we wanted to think a little bit more about the idea of narrative that you sort of get from these albums, and how sequences are coming out. We have a library table at the center, which features 4 facsimiles of albums, which viewers are encouraged to flip through. And so 3 characters who help guide us through this are the tourist, Isabella Stewart Gardner, the trailblazer, Lai Fong from Hong Kong, and then the storyteller, John Thompson. And I won't go too much into detail of them, but suffice to say, I think they were really 3 different ways of thinking about the album and the idea of stories. And the last section is called, of the historic material, is called Facing the Camera. By the late 19th century, Chinese sitters had harnessed photography as a new medium for self-fashioning. So these are 2 striking portraits of Hao Qua and Hao Qua's son. Hao Qua was, in the 19th century, the richest man in the world. He was the Bill Gates of his time, and he was somebody who controlled trade between Westerners and Chinese in the early 1800s. So as a sort of token of his relationship, he would make these portraits, commission oil paintings of himself, which he then dispersed to families that he was trading with. And so you can actually find his portrait in many major collections along the East Coast of the United States. His portrait is in the Met, it's in Philadelphia, it's also in our collection in MFA Boston, because of these families that were doing business with him. And then we have a couple of his portraits in our collection, but then we had not really known about this object on the right. We had no evidence of any sort of portrait that his son had made. But then as we were looking through some of the provenance materials for this collection, we noticed this little note, Ho Qua from Life after a negative by Robert Sturgis. And, our colleagues were like, oh, we'll never find this. We don't know exactly where it is. But then actually they did find it. And what it turned out to be was a panotype, and which is really quite rare. A panotype is a photograph that was made on a piece of textile, usually leather or black material. And it was only really used as for a hot minute because it was a terrible piece of technology. Like the emulsion would flake out of the textile. So we found this, and it was made of Wu Chongyao, who is Hao Qua's son, and by a Massachusetts merchant, Robert Sturgis, who took it to France, and then it was transferred from the negative onto this panotype piece of material of textile. And what is really interesting is that we have many, many, many copies of the painting of his father, but we only have this one panotype of the son. We think that it's really ironic thinking that the photograph is the one that's the singular. But we think that he was trying to do something like what his father was doing through painting, but through this newfound technology of the camera and photography. It was just that he chose, or rather the person who took this photograph chose a panotype medium, which was not very conducive to having multiple copies made. So that's, I think, a really wonderful story of how I think photography was integrated across generations, but was still very experimental at this point. So we have a lot of portraits in this section, and thinking about how Chinese sitters started to adopt different ways and sort of symbols of how they wanted to be seen, from the orchard, which is like a sort of symbol of scholarly integrity, to the pocket watch, the book, the fan. And we have examples of paintings like ancestor portraits and these yuzhao, these glamour photo paintings that are incorporating photographic techniques into the painting itself as well. And so in these kind of senses, you have like the best of both worlds. You have the paintings of beautiful, sort of auspicious symbols, but also sort of photographic likeness. And so the last part of this exhibition is the conclusion is called New Perspectives. And it was a really experimental, I think, and successful experiment in terms of how to have a contemporary viewpoint or response to a historic collection. What we did was we felt it was really important for Chinese photographers to look at this collection and to have a sort of activation of it, really thinking about some of the themes of this show. So we decided to partner with a transnational cohort of artists to run a virtual incubator. We did this all during the pandemic. It was about 3 months. We met weekly with this cohort of 10 photographers who were in China, who were all emerging and thinking, we thought through with them some of the themes of the show. So then they each made their own works that were sort of a direct response to our collection, which were wonderful in terms of how they were exploring gender, body, land, and it was really eye-opening, I think. So for example, we had this work by Shi Yankun, who was a photographer who was really taken by those early photographs that Beato made of Yuanmingyuan, this place that had been looted by the British and the French. And so he went and found a one-to-one recreation of the site based on a film studio. And then he used the wet plate collodion technique to recreate some of his scenes in his mind. And then he sent those as postcards to the United States, to us in Salem. And he was thinking a lot about the sort of gaps and blurs and sort of the sort of distortions that happen as you send information across time and space. And especially because this was a recreated site. And so we were very fully prepared to just show whatever we got, but by a miracle of the US and Chinese Postal Service, we got all 40 of these postcards. So we were able to see his entire project. And then another one I thought was really beautiful was Liu Yufan, who was thinking about how photography was adopted as a form of portraiture. And she was thinking a lot about her grandmother, who she lost during COVID, and this new technology of infrared thermal imaging that was used to sort of control who had like elevated temperatures in sort of transit systems during the times of COVID. And so she used that sort of thermal camera to sort of sit in the places that her grandmother sat and like touch the places where her grandmother touched her, so that those heat signatures would be captured by the camera. And so I think this was a wonderful way in which she's thinking about these ideas of portraiture, but at the same time incorporating new technologies into it as well. So I think that's the whirlwind of power and perspective. But just to sort of wrap up on that, I think it was a really complicated show because the history of this period is really complicated, but it really shows how the origins of photography in China were inextricable from the sort of colonial encounter, and yet it becomes something that's co-opted by Chinese to fit larger stories about adaptation, agency, and survival. And it raises questions about the business and market of 19th century photography, the ethics of photographic encounters, and then the power of image-based narratives in illuminating and distorting our knowledge of the past. So this was a really wonderful sort of first, I think, exhibition that really delved into PEM's collection and its history really, really deeply. So now, we're in the 19th century, I'm going to turn really quickly to the 20th and 21st century to just talk a little bit about As We Rise, and then we can take some questions. So this is the next upcoming, this is the sneak preview. I don't have installation shots because the things are not installed yet. We don't have any of these photographs installed. So I just wanted to give you a sneak preview of what's coming. It's opening in 2 weeks on June 17th. So As We Rise and is an exhibition of photography of the Black Atlantic from the Wedge Collection, a Toronto-based collection established by Dr. Kenneth Montague, that is committed to representing African diaspora culture and contemporary Black life. So this is a show that was already curated by Aperture. This is going to be the third venue for this show. It was premiered at the University of Toronto Art Museum, and then it went over to the Polygon Gallery in Vancouver. And then we are the third stop. And then it's really different. It's one of 107 works and about 75 artists from Canada, Caribbean, Britain, US, South America. And it was really from Kenneth's collection. Kenneth had seen a photograph of James Van Der Zees in the Detroit Institute of Art. And it showed this wonderful couple in Harlem in raccoon coats. And this was something that had stayed with him as from the time he was 10 years old as something that to aspire to. It was a sort of positive reflection of Black life in America. And so he sort of thought about this. And then when he became a successful dentist, he made a commitment to collect that work. And then that sort of became the sort of heart of the collection. He began the collection with that piece. And so this is a very, very different show. We thought a lot about how we were going to link all these works. There's 75 artists, but each of them have one or two works. And what is the way that we can sort of think about creating these themes or connecting them thematically? So the big idea is that As We Rise celebrates a myriad experiences of Black life through the lenses of community, identity, and power. This is based on the book that he wrote with Aperture, and those are the sort of chapters: community, identity, and power. But then what we did is that we thought about how that could be related to a song. So we have all these themes like community that then have the theme and then the variations of the themes. So there's things like community as expanded family, community as belonging, community as care, identity as seeing ourselves, and identity as declaration, identity as self-fashioning. And then there's a sort of break. There's the refusal, which I think of that as like, you know, if you're thinking in the metaphor of a song, this is like the sort of guitar break. And then we have power as reclamation, power as restoration, and power as rest and leisure. Ending with a coda of joy and groove. And so I think this was a way in which we could sort of respect those themes of community, identity, and power, but still sort of thread these sort of ideas of these variations through in this sort of, I think, exhibition structure. And then we end, I think, with a sort of a reflection where we think about what community could be and have a response station where people can sort of, there are these little Polaroid templates that says, what does community mean to you? And we encourage people to draw and respond to that in this little sort of station. So yeah, this is a totally different exhibition. Very sort of, I think the other one was very historical. This is very contemporary. It's much more about mood and feel. There will also be a playlist that is, since everything is inspired by music in this exhibition, we're thinking there's also a playlist that Kenneth curated because a lot of the works that he was showing and collecting were part of his Sunday salons, where he would invite people to his home, which had this wedge-shaped gallery. And they would sort of look at these photographs, but also listen to music. And so this sort of relationship between music and photography is something that we're really thinking about with this show. So this is coming in June 17th. It'll be up for 6 months. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, comments about these, and I'm happy to discuss anything more about shows, PEM's collections, and, you know, historic and contemporary photography. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Really excited for the new show and Power and Perspective. I'm going to paste the links to both of the catalogs into the chat so that folks can get the books themselves. And I think we should all unmute and give Stephanie a round of applause before we start questions.
Yeah.
We do have some questions in the chat, and if everyone could stay on mute, and I'll relay those to Stephanie, and then if we have some time, we will add a little question session at the end. So the first question is from Bernie Zelich, who was our presenter last month. And Bernie asks, you said there were political reasons that the Chinese government does not keep photo archives. Can you explain?
Sure, that's a really great question. I think photography is really difficult in China, and this is something that I think is like the notion. I think there are photo archives. The photographs are in historical archives, but there is not any sort of like national photography museum. There's no sort of like national photography collection like at the NGA. I think a lot of this also has to do with notions of the truth value of photography. I think that's actually really sort of contentious still. And I also think that it's related to the cultural evolution. Cultural evolution happened in the 1960s, and that was a point in which there's this desire to destroy a lot of traditional works. And so even though photography was modern, it was considered like it would potentially link you to things that were bourgeois or politically sensitive. So many families just destroyed their photographic albums. You know, this was part of a huge political movement at that time, which means that there are not many of these photographic collections in China anymore. I think when we have a lot of Chinese scholars who come to PEM just to see the photographic collections here because they have some sort of connection, like provenance collection to like people who were actually in China. And, you know, I think we always are, you know, remind people that photographs are part of a market. And so that's not, you know, there are certain photographs that get reproduced again and again and again that are not sort of really, I guess, reflective of the state of things, but still they're really important pieces of documentation. And I think that for something like the state, it's something that is hugely sensitive. Who sees that, like what sort of things and stories that those photographs can tell. This might be more of a case with 20th century photographs, but like, you know, yeah, 19th and 20th century photo collections don't really exist publicly in China.
Thank you. Larry is asking if Power and Perspective will be at any other museum.
Unfortunately, no. I think it is something that's so specific to PEM's collection and the works that are sort of integrated in both of our, both the photography and Asian export collections, that it's difficult to travel. And we were thinking about also like the light sensitivity of the works. And so it will be, we have a catalog. So the catalog is the sort of, I think the publication is a sort of, long-standing sort of monument, I think, to this exhibition, but unfortunately we won't travel anywhere else.
Thanks. Gary is asking, were any photographs by Lorenzo Fisler, F-I-S-L-E-R, included in Power and Perspective?
Yes, actually. We had one photograph of Lorenzo Fisler's of Li Hongzhang, who was a statesman who was similar to Frederick Douglass or I think Ulysses S. Grant. He was a contemporary of those figures. And Fisler took a photograph of Li Hongzhang and it's circulated in many magazines. So we do have one of the Fislers that was featured in the show.
Reich is asking, were there any cross connections between the China trading ports and the opening of Japan?
There were a couple of, I think there are some relationships because opening of Japan was 1868, I think, with Meiji revolutions. And I think even before that, a lot of the figures were similar. Matthew Perry, Eliphalet Brown were photographing. Eliphalet Brown was the person who took the first photographs of Japan. They were part of these larger missions to, I think, open up Asia. I think China was had much more involvement from the British and the French, and then I think in Japan it was much more of the Americans, and so it's kind of, but they were sort of circulating in these ports. by the 1860s, in which I think Charles Leander Reed was working, it was part of a circuit to go from, Boston, New York, across the Panama Canal, San Francisco, Hawaii, Japan, China. And so this was definitely a trade circuit that, at least by the 1860s, was very, very popular.
Great. There's Rosamond posted a question about the Black Atlantic, but I'm not really sure what the question is. Were you asking if it includes Canada, US, and islands?
It's a term that was unfamiliar to me, and I just wanted to get verification that it meant to include Canadian, north of the US, and down into the islands. It's just a new concept to me. I think of it as being very much American.
Sure, that's a really great question, and that's something that we do explain at the very beginning of the show.
Yeah, good.
Black Atlantic is a concept or a way of seeing that allows us to make those sort of connections. It reflects a legacy of the transatlantic trade, slave trade. So it includes Africa, the Caribbeans, South America, Canada, and also UK and Europe. And so it's all these places that are ringing the Atlantic that had some involvement with the transatlantic slave trade. And it's a term that's been used, I think, in recent scholarship to think about these connections, the diasporic connections, shared histories and cultures and identities across diasporic groups that are connected by this, by the historic legacy of slavery. So I think it's a new term, I think, that sort of tries to make these connections.
Thank you. Very interesting.
I had just a couple questions. I noticed that in the catalog, I think it was Mark's essay where he talked about there's no such thing as the 19th century, and how that relates to how China defined period and time. And I like the way that in the catalog it was broken into those three sort of phases. Can you talk about that a little?
Sure. So this is all happening in the 19th century. This is all happening in the Qing dynasty. And the Qing dynasty was started in 1644 and lasted until 1911. And so it was a really long dynasty. And it was the Manchus who were Manchu sort of, actually, you could say, like, they were colonizers in themselves who took over from the Ming dynasty. And so they were, I guess you could say, colonizers who sort of adopted Chinese traditions, bureaucracy, literature, arts, and sort of integrated themselves into the Chinese bureaucracy. And so when you think about this notion of the 19th century, it's very Eurocentric. Like, it's very much something that if you were a Chinese person living in 1844, it would just be, this would be like, I think, year of 32 of the Guangxu reign. That's totally sort of like, I don't know exactly what year it is, but it is part of, like, a larger sort of conception of time, and thinking about, a dynasty that started in 1644 and ended in 1911. And so I thought Marx was really interesting because he sort of broke down the idea of the Qing dynasty from what it would mean from a Chinese perspective. Like, you had this height in the early sort of the 1700s and then the early 1800s. And then you had this sort of like upheaval, which is at the mid 1800s, which is when photography entered. And then you had the decline at the end that leads into 1911, which is when the sort of Chinese Civil War began, and then the Republic was established. Qing dynasty was the last dynasty of China. And so this was really, I think, a good way of us to rethink, I think, the sort of perspective from a Chinese, just a normal Chinese person's perspective of time, and how this was related to you know, a different sort of notion of time at that period.
Great, thank you. I don't see any more questions. I know that we have about 5 minutes left, and then we have to end sort of right on time tonight. So does anyone have any questions they want to ask live?
Yeah, I was wondering, those mammoth plates that you displayed, you know what the dimensions of those plates were by any chance?
Oh, I have, they're in the catalog, but I can't remember exactly what they were. But they were kind of this by this. So they're quite big. Yeah, I can find that for you, but I don't have that off.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
And Stephanie, if you are willing to put your email address into the chat for questions, maybe people could reach out also after the presentation.
Yeah.
And that would be great. And I just want to say how thrilled we are that you could join us tonight. And we're so happy to have you as a new member of PHSNE. And you know, the exhibition coming up in June is very exciting. I can't wait. And I hope that, you know, folks who can will visit and make sure to see if one of the things I love about PEM's response at the end of each exhibition is the way that viewers can leave comments in a notebook or with a posted message, like a little post-it, or just ways that people can interact. And PEM preserves those responses. You know, they're digitized and become part of the record that is later available for people to view digitally. So there is a way to sort of respond to it and be a part of the exhibition. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if people could like leave their image, like their own image somehow, and just it's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to it. One of the things that PEM does really well is allow folks to interact, I think. And there are always activities, there's always events. So check the museum's website for related events to the exhibit coming up and other things that you might want to take in when you're at the museum itself.
And I would just to sort of expand on that. I think that's a really good point. I'm, you know, I'm very open. Like, I'd love to hear from you about, like, you know, the things that interest you, the kinds of exhibitions that interest you. Like, you know, if it's historic, if it's like collection based, it's like, you know, contemporary. Like, these are all things that I think, like, I'm in the midst of dreaming up the next couple, 5 years, 6 years. So this is like, you know, I love feedback. And so what things were really like inspiring to you or interesting? What were the things that were like, you know, not so interesting? And I do think that sort of interaction that Dana was saying was really, I do think that's a specialty of PEM's. We did try to think about like having people leave their own images. We went through this whole thing about Polaroids and trying to figure out if we could actually get, it just became like too messy in terms of like cost and then like how to, you know, get everything. It was just, we tried, but so this was like a sort of compromise where we had have Polaroid templates, but not like not actual Polaroids. Maybe in the next exhibition where we can figure out a way to do that. So yeah, if you guys have ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Yes, please reach out. And tonight, I just wanted to remind folks that we're going to be off for the summer for 2 months. So the next presentation will be in September. And one of the presentations that we'll be having, I'm not sure which month yet, is the Peabody Museum has an archive of photographs from journalists that they've been given a huge number of negatives, which they have digitized. So we're going to be looking at some Essex County sort of history as far as journalism goes, 20th century, mostly, I believe. So please look forward to that. Keep your eye on the newsletter. And again, Stephanie, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure. It was great to have you.
You're very welcome. It was my pleasure. And
Well,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
cheers.
Thank you. That was
Yes.
excellent. Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Stephanie, when do you plan on finishing up your PhD?
This is the summer project. Summer project. But I also, I mean, the other thing is I have to have a handle on the collection, and the other sort of areas that we have: Japan, Korea, India. We have a lot of North Shore. We have New England. We have a lot of maritime photography, obviously. So that's like the sort of other to really start thinking about what's, you know, beyond. My little world has really been focused on this China collection for so long. Now I'm thinking about everything else, including my own dissertation. So yeah, love to have feedback and stuff. But yeah, this summer will be pretty quiet and hoping.
I bet, but thank you.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, best wishes for dissertation writing. So everyone, thank you so much. And this recording will be on our YouTube channel also in a couple of weeks. Ben just edits a bit. And so there will be a link that we can share with everyone. And it was great hearing about the exhibit after having been and revisiting it this way. So it was really, I want to thank you so much. And everyone, I think that's it for this evening. Keep your eyes on snapshots. We will see you in September. John and Ben, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you and have a good summer.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Dana.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Everyone have a great summer. We'll see you in September.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Night.